This is The Persuasion Game, the Forges podcast all about the art of persuasion. Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their customers, convince their stakeholders and drive their businesses forward. Hey Laura, how are you?
I'm very good, Adam. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. You must be flying high after your talk with Katie Evans at Advertising Week this week.
It was a very busy week, yes. Friend of the pod, Katie Evans from Burger King, very kindly asked us to continue the conversation that we started on the pod a few weeks ago. And we spoke specifically at Advertising Week with her telling audience about the Bundles of Joy campaign, which was the delivery service advertisement that showed the new mums really enjoying a big burger and the kind of reaction to that. It was a great conversation. It's very different, isn't it? Like speaking to a room where you can see people's faces versus just speaking into a mic.
Well, I was in the audience and you both did brilliantly. And it was a packed out room, wasn't it? There was lots of people there very interested in that campaign. I thought it was a very, very well attended talk. And to be honest with you, I was sat near the front row, and when you popped the advert up on the screen, I mean, I got a bit emotional, and I was a little bit worried that I'd be sat there in a room full of advertisers, you know, with tears in my eyes. But I managed to hold it together.
It still makes me wince, the ad, to be honest with you, but that's for my own personal reasons. No, it was really interesting, and yes, it was incredibly well attended. And Katie spoke hyper articulately. And one of the reasons we wanted to carry on the conversation about what we heard today was I think Katie touched on something that was really interesting and what I saw a lot of the room really engaging with. And that was the idea of everybody having to think like a challenger now. Obviously, when you go to something like Advertising Week, people are like the best and the brightest are being asked to speak about the kind of leading edge and where the conversation is going. So it's all sorts of different perspectives. But what was really striking was that was a theme that we heard from a number of brands, wasn't it? It
was, yeah. I mean, I attended the Jaguar talk, which was, you know, again, very well attended for obvious reasons. But the managing director of Jaguar, he shared the reasons why Jaguar kind of rebranded in the way that they did. But a lot of what he was saying was about kind of wanting to challenge the status quo, do things differently. And, you know, for a huge business like Jaguar, with its production lines of cars coming off, and in order to behave like a challenger, it required some very kind of significant changes to kind of what they're doing, both on the brand front, but also business model wise.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You could reflect on the different reasons that has started to happen. Jaguar obviously have their own specific reasons, which they talked everyone through. But I think what it tapped into is something that Nick Manning was talking to us about, which was the whole change of media landscape has meant that it's not business as usual for brands anymore. We look at the kind of way that brands are communicating with people. So, you know, platforms have really sort of made a very uniform world where it doesn't really matter if you're the biggest brand. You know, you still have a much more fragmented audience, a much more inverted relationship with that audience. So it's trying to meet them on their level rather than sort of talking down and giving one uniform message.
And gone are the days of the big cultural moment where a brand can launch its advert, everybody sees it, everybody's talking about it. You really have to now work your way into the conversation in a much more kind of authentic and meaningful way.
Precisely. And also, I think it kind of plays into the fact that, one, your voice is not as amplified as a brand, but also perhaps your voice is not as trusted. You know, we see things from like the Edelman report every year. Whilst brands are more trusted than governments, it is declining year on year. And brands are really having to communicate in a way that kind of earns that trust and authenticity and right to speak, rather than just saying like, you know, behold, I've proclaimed my latest campaign to you all. So yeah,
if it doesn't feel real, then people are much quicker now to kind of switch off and not listen.
Yes, absolutely. And even things like measuring click-through and engagement, you can see that so much of what we do engage with is very, very surface. So it really gave evidence to this idea that we really need to find a way to communicate with people in a way that's actually meaningful to them. And I think it's also about meeting people where they are and using that as a kind of springboard, using people themselves and where they are, using insight to create something relevant rather than kind of deciding you were going to create a culture.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about Burger King and Jaguar is when you consider the awareness of both of those businesses. You know, everyone knows about Burger King, everyone knows about Jaguar, and their big challenge is about consideration and how do they kind of get people to reappraise the products or the services that are being offered and kind of take them up. Yes, everyone knows about Jaguar. Yes, there's a huge number of people who would desire a Jaguar, but there just aren't enough of them to actually sustain a business. There's not enough of those people out there who are actually buying the cars. And so part of the rebrand is identifying an audience that they do believe will be able to buy the cars. And in order to get to them, they needed to rebrand what Jaguar is all about all the way through to the actual cars that come off the production line.
It's a really interesting exemplar, but you hear about it so much from all sorts of FMCG brands as well. Brands that everyone would consider a household name, saying, oh, yeah, we have, really high awareness, really high brand perceptions. Does it actually drive conversion? Does it actually, make a difference in terms of what people pay? No, not really. And it's that bigger point, I guess, that taps into private label growth, or just also the sense of there being a lot more choice, people really needing to speak to people in a way that, as you say, converts, drives new appraisal, makes people really want to buy into the proposition because they feel like it's for them.
Yeah, and I think, Katie talked to us about this on the podcast and again on during the talk. The way that they did that through the Bundles of Joy campaign was to grab attention with a specific group of people, women, and let them really feel that kind of intense hunger that they have felt. And it's not saying the only time to buy Burger King is after you've given birth, because I guess they wouldn't sell many burgers
niche,
that way. Yeah. But it's about when you have that intense craving for food, or you really want to feel satisfied, then the kind of Burger King promise of food fulfillment can satisfy that. And secondary to that, they were also talking about, which I hadn't actually noticed, to be completely honest, they were also talking about their delivery service. But what's quite interesting about that campaign is it was so much about reappraisal of the burgers as well, that the kind of the purpose of the advert, which was to tell everyone about the delivery thing, I think you could actually see it or not see it.
Yeah, it's completely different, isn't it? Because I was in brand management 20 years ago, to my horror, and it was so focused on measuring, has your campaign objective been delivered? And now that sort of feels just so quaint, because one, you would never have a sort of season of a campaign, you would be always on all the time. But two, the idea that you weren't using that to push your brand forward, it was all about that specific variant or that, specific new format. It just feels so sort of sweet, really. Oh, did you really think people were just going to buy your brand for the sake of it? People are really having to work hard to keep pushing that brand consideration button all the time. And it is creating some really powerful work that genuinely engages people, very emotively. I think Katie had some great things to say about that.
Over to Katie.
You have ways to get there, but equally you need to, yes, be part of that consideration, become a favorite. And, obviously your strategy is built around, how do we do that? How do we cut through especially a very noisy category, and a category where there's a huge amount of investment in media? We don't necessarily have that same budget. So it's all about, how do we find ways to cut through? How do we find interesting and differentiated ways to engage our consumer?
So, we're talking about challenger brands here. We're talking about brands that are trying to get into the discourse, influencing behavior or challenging people to reappraise the product and consider it. But you can't just jump into any conversation, can you? You've got to be quite specific about where you're showing up and the types of conversation that you want to be a part of.
It's so right. And that's the paradox, really, isn't it? Because I think there was also, in the rooms that we heard, a sort of sense that perhaps people had jumped a bit blindly into certain topics, particularly when purpose was the sort of catch-all for what gave you meaning. Definitely heard a lot of comments about how pride was perhaps something that people bandwagoned on a little bit, and it's been really interesting to see who's stuck with that and who hasn't. And it all kind of gives even more focus to where should you be playing? Mm-hmm. If you're going to have to be really wholehearted and throw yourself in with a distinctive point of view, you kind of need to be really judicious about where your right to play is, and think about, can another brand do it better? That was a really interesting point that Katie made, actually, was sometimes you shouldn't be thinking about, oh, could someone else in my category do it better? It's like, is there another brand persona that does it better? She mentioned Specsavers.
Yeah, she called out Specsavers, yeah.
who are, really, really fun and really dynamic in a lot of spaces. So, don't try and be the meal version of Specsavers, like find your own right to play. But I thought that was just such an interesting point, wasn't it? Because obviously you would think it would be all about the other quick service restaurants.
Yeah, and I think that really taps into a lot of the things that Rawdon Glover, the Jaguar MD, was saying, which is that they were trying to tap into a mindset, the mindset of who the future consumer might be of these new cars. And that was part of the reason why they launched at Miami Art Week and not a car show. They were looking for celebrities, people that are leading culture. They were looking for people that could afford to buy, fine art, and looking for people that really appreciated like an aesthetic and design. And so they built the brand. They teased the brand and then launched the brand into Miami Art Week as the kind of first big reveal that they did. And that was really quite interesting when you think about the conversation that they wanted to enter and sort of how to reposition.
It's a different frame, isn't it?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, it was similar stuff with talking to Katie about the research they did for Burger King, because obviously the route you would traditionally take when you're launching a campaign is you would do focus groups. And you do focus groups with people who were fans of Burger King but had low awareness of delivery. And what she said very fervently, and I really support her on this, was your idea will die if you test it that way. If you use the traditional mechanics of like a really big, bold idea like that, it will not, serve you well, because it won't be meeting the sort of standard parameters of success, and it will be controversial for some people, and some people will not endorse that mindset, that way of looking at things. So what they actually did was they went to Mumsnet, and they ran research in partnership with them, which was really about understanding, like, what is authentic portrayal of hunger? Like, how did you actually feel? What's the kind of reality? And I think it's just such a different way of looking at the role that we can play as well, rather than saying like, yes, this is standardized and validated. It's actually about enhancing and tapping into a wider space, a wider conversation by, where you seek to build your information from or where you seek to land your story, right?
Both leaders we listened to both really lean into this idea that it's not going to be for everyone. Some people are not going to like this. And I, having heard both of them speak, I'm just, so inspired by the way that they can release something into the wild and then just wait and just see what happens rather than jumping in and trying to fix things or change things immediately. Rawdon talked about, obviously, we all know what happened with the Jaguar, the launch. It got quite nasty in some places. I think it ended up with some of the people that actually, the individuals working at Jaguar being put in the Daily Mail and kind of singled out. So it got quite...
Daily Mail would do that to someone. Can't believe it.
And there was a point where they had to kind of, intervene in the conversation, but they only did it just to kind of emphasize a point which they felt needed to be emphasized, which was that actually it's always been in Jaguar's spirit to kind of challenge convention and challenge the status quo. And so I think, there's something really about, if you are going to enter the conversation, it's entering it like a conversation and listening to the answer and not just trying to control it totally to yourself.
Yeah, I enjoyed hearing Katie talk about that as well, because I was always really struck by Burger King's ability to let the conversation be. There was a really strong response and interesting language. People, they should be ashamed of themselves. Like, this is and actually sort of not falling into your basest instincts of replying, go, I'm not ashamed of myself, this is a great campaign. And to sort of really sit with that and then see the response, which was actually from mums and midwives and people who actually had real experiences saying, this works for me, I feel seen. It's part of an interesting conversation about being real about mums, was really interesting. I think the way she phrased it was, we had said what we had to say on it, and then it was kind of over to someone else.
Yeah, it's pretty clear what we had to say on the matter, so why say anything more? And I think that was the difference between that campaign and the Rawdon one, was there was a slight lack of clarity on the Jaguar side, I think, from people saying, you're changing everything, this is like not Jaguar. And he was like, well, actually, if you go back through the history books here, we have consistently kind of, pushed the envelope in terms of changing things and doing things that people weren't going to expect.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's all to do with your kind of appetite for risk of how stuff is received, right? And Katie talked a lot about the fact that because they have always been a challenger, this is not the first time that they've done something that was a little bit edgy. As a team, they have a really strong working relationship that balances risk and trust. I can imagine with Jaguar, as you say, things coming off the line, huge iconic British brand, there's probably a lot more nervousness about setting the tone and managing the conversation. And to be honest, even talking, hearing the talk from Vaseline, that felt similar. They were very keen to enter a modern cultural conversation. They knew that they weren't just being experienced on TV. They knew that they were being experienced on TikTok, and that the product was being used in various different ways. But what was striking was they were moving into that space, but doing it in a much more curated way than perhaps some other brands were. So they were saying, we're going to observe like the top 100 uses of Vaseline, and we're going to cherry pick 30, I think quite rightly.
I was worried then for a second.
Yeah, don't worry.
Well, no filters at all.
And then it was all about, them bringing their science, their technology to like prove or disprove if something was working. And that was an interesting kind of middle ground, I thought, because yes, it was them being authentic. They even had their own scientists, saying this is Vaseline verified as a strategic good use of something. And they were tapping into interesting cultural things like, I don't know if you saw the Oscars, but the glam bot. Did you?
I don't know.
This is the difference in cats and dogs. Like, I know nothing about Jaguar, but I could talk to you about the glam bot at the Oscars all day.
I want to know more.
It was basically like a camera that took a shot of people as they came in, but it moves incredibly quickly. But what it means is the image you get is almost sort of luminescent, like real old style Hollywood images that people have got. Very like putting Vaseline on the lens way back when.
Yeah.
So they're doing a partnership with the person that invented the glam bot. I think his name's Cole Walliser. And it's very cool. I suggest you give him a follow. But yeah, a lot more sort of curated, a bit more safe, but still dipping your toe into the conversation that is being led by consumers.
No, I really like that. It's a different approach, isn't it? It's not like, let's create the conversation. It's like, here's a conversation that's already going on about our brand and about use cases for it.
Yes.
Why wouldn't we have a role in this conversation to talk about actually, well, you know what, guys, yeah, fine. These 30 or 40 use cases are things that we would stand up to, but actually some of these things you're doing are pretty weird, let's be honest. And
which I think is also taps into the fact that they are like quite a medical brand, right? Yeah. They're about safety and they're about healing.
Yeah.
It would be a bit weird if they suddenly were like, have at it, do all of the things. So when Katie was talking about the need to explore differently, the need to sort of get a feeling for it if an idea might work outside of the usual focus group or, quant study, it did make me think of the conversation we had with Nick.
Nick Graham.
Yeah, when he was talking about his experiences at Pepsi and getting that intuitive feeling that something either was or wasn't working. And one of the examples he gave was great, which was he had a feeling that people were saying they loved Pepsi, but it wasn't linking back to distribution. And when he actually looked at the drawings that people had done, it was all 1970s logos. And it just made me think about the conversation we had of you need to have this inkling for where something might be interesting. Let's hear what Nick said.
And I remember when sitting in, actually with one of our senior leaders, sitting in a focus group, watching some of our core consumers, and we were just testing out some different directions of packaging. And we had this logo design that was very similar, certainly reminiscent of the old logo. And you just saw people go, oh my God, this is like the old logo. And you could see the energy in the room. When you can feel, and a piece of qualitative research, you can feel the energy go up.
So, I mean, in the instance of Bundles of Joy with Katie, I can imagine showing that film to certain people, some people having a sort of visceral, I'm not really into this, other people like really going, this is amazing. And at that point, you then have to take the call. Okay, there's very strong emotion in this. None of it's really going to like derail Burger King per se, but actually because of the kind of strength of opinion, it's going to create a really interesting conversation. And there's going to be some people that are really kind of advocating for it.
So you've got to be all in on that, haven't you?
Yeah.
And on the subject of being all in, I was fascinated by the fact that Jaguar are not producing new cars until this is land. Is that right? So they're shuttered?
Yes, because they're transitioning from, part of the strategy is to transition from petrol engine cars or diesel to electric vehicles. They are effectively turning off all of their factory lines, shutting down all the production on the existing models and relaunching the brand in the interim before bringing out the new cars, which is like, textbook marketing 101, establish your brand, work out your target audience, consider your positioning, how you're going to land it, and then move into the kind of products rather than do the products first and try and figure out your brand later. However, in the reality of like running a car manufacturer, it's extremely bold and brave, and in fascinating case study this is going to be to watch back over time.
It will be so interesting. I mean, this is one that is going to be in the textbooks one way or the other. I'm tempted to say it might work. Like, having listened to the strategy and the insights and the way that they're going about it, it feels like, as you say, as crazy as it initially sounded, it is strategically quite sound.
I mean, you've got to consider it, Jaguar is part of a portfolio which includes Land Rover, which is, absolutely flying, by every single metric you can imagine. Land Rover is doing well in the car industry. And Jaguar is like working out what its place in that portfolio is. And so they're now trying to pivot into a new category and taking the bits of the brand with them that they feel can serve them in that new category, but being totally okay with shedding the bits that they don't think, that could bring baggage rather than bringing something positive.
Yeah, that was the lovely bit, wasn't it? Actually, that talking about tapping into your heritage in a way that is meaningful, because I think it is so tempting with new platforms to almost be like, baby out with the bathwater. This is all really, really difficult to, hold on to anything. We've got to have a completely different way of talking to people. And it does sort of become a bit like that Steve Buscemi, like, hello, fellow kids. Like, everyone's just trying to be cool rather than actually being who they really are. And I think that was what was really interesting to reflect on was, for Katie, it wasn't a sort of crazy trying to create controversy to have this conversation. BK have always been a challenger. They've always had looked for interesting spaces to tap into. They've always been about real food hunger, and that met the need, and that was why they were confident to do it. I think similarly what you were saying about Jaguars, they would argue this is an evolution of what they've always been talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, and also to your point about all in, I don't think they can achieve what they're trying to do without being all in. You can't do a kind of really crazy rebrand. You've got to fully go for it. The really interesting thing for me about Jaguar is, Rawdon would argue that, yes, a lot of that business is changing. Yes, they're moving from, petrol cars to electric cars. Yes, the look of the cars is going to be different. They've got a crazy new color palette. It's really exciting. They're mixing in different circles. But actually, he would argue that the brand heritage, the original brand heritage from Jaguar, the kind of ethos around copy nothing, is exactly what they're doing. They've existed in a car category, which is all starting to look kind of the same. And now they're trying to do something completely different. And I just think that's really interesting, that actually your brand could just be about a thought or like or a behavior rather than being about all the kind of brand assets that we would normally associate with building good brands.
Yeah, that is so interesting, actually, isn't it? That it's the ethos you're going to hold on to rather than the DBAs. Because it's kind of the opposite of a lot of the conversation we've been hearing, which is just be everywhere with the assets that people know. And it's almost more like tap into the spirit of the brand and see if you can use it to take you in a different way.
So, I mean, just thinking about these three examples, you could put them on a sliding scale, couldn't you? At one end, you've got Jaguar, which is completely transforming its entire business, its business model, its customers, everything is up for grabs. Yeah. And they are pulling through a kind of ethos with how, as their North Star about how they're going to do things. Kind of in the middle, you've got Burger King, who are looking to start and lead and push conversations and be in that conversation. So the Jaguar example creates the conversation because obviously such an iconic brand is doing this. Burger King, for the last 7 years since Katie has been there, has been looking to kind of jump on the cultural conversation and kind of push the conversation. But actually what I find really interesting is Vaseline is also on this scale, but it's just found a really unique way to kind of insert itself into the conversation that already exists. So there's a kind of like sliding scale about how big and bold you want to be.
Yeah.
And I think for me, most brands can kind of find somewhere on this scale to kind of fit in.
I mean, the interesting thing from the Vaseline talk was I don't think they actually felt particularly at an advantage in this conversation. I think there is an argument to make to say if you're a challenger, it's kind of easier to make these bigger and bold plays, but it's a necessity to evolve your brand and to identify the spaces in which you can sort of hold on to your heritage but go into something new. And as you say, they've chosen to do it in a slightly more way that's authentic to them, that's a little bit more curated than perhaps the Jaguar approach, but still really brave. I think the other thing that struck me is, if we think about the role of insights, is people were not looking they were looking to consumers, but they were not looking through sort of traditional metrics. They were looking to broader conversations beyond their categories. They were looking to different sources of information. They were looking to places where people are at their most sort of authentic and candid, and looking to express themselves in their wider context, not just as consumers of burgers, as users of Vaseline, as, you know, it really was about what's going on in your real life and how can we be part of that conversation. And that can only be a really healthy thing for brands, I think, to get them, you know, really adding value to people's lives, right?
Yeah, they've almost like zoomed out from consumers, individual consumers, you know, mum, 35 to 50, 2 kids, like to actually a conversation about culture.
Yeah.
In all 3 examples.
Yeah.
It's actually, you know, how do we understand what cultural conversations are going on, and how do we kind of influence them and be part of them? And in some of those brands' cases, they're looking to lead that cultural conversation. Take Jaguar, you know, launching at Miami Art Week. And in others, it's, okay, what kind of interesting things are happening on TikTok and how can we be part of this? I think it's quite interesting thinking about consumers less as the individuals, but also actually where are the conversations happening?
Absolutely. Well, it was great stuff.
Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, then make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app. And just a last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on social media. Search The Forge on LinkedIn.